Margaret already led off, before I introduce Nick, Margaret already led off with some other upcoming events that we have. I thought I would just go through them quickly for people to know. So our next event is next Friday, a conference on intellectual freedom in Southeast Asia and the US. It's a hybrid event if people are interested. Next one. Then we have Una Paredes from UCLA on People of the Book, translating an oral tradition into written form in Luma Mindanao. It's a Higaonon book, I think the first ever to be published in Higaonon. So that's very exciting. That is the evening before Halloween. And then we have a film called Breaking the Cycle. And then this is like Princeton, couple of weeks. Conthida, who is a MPP candidate at SPIA at Princeton, will be speaking on the pro-democracy movement in Thailand. And that's November 5th. And then November 7th, I think, looking at the date, yes, Chiara Formici on domestic nationalism, Muslim women, health and modernity, Indonesia, in conversation with Sydney.
Yep. And I think that's it.
And so that's the next couple of weeks. People would be.
Oh, yes. The Getsy film is on the 18th.
Yeah, the 18th.
We don't have the flyer yet.
Sending some stuff around about that. So Nick is a professor at Princeton. He's going to be speaking on his book, States Against Nations, and has written a mountain of other stuff, all of which I would highly recommend people to look at. He's has his PhD from UC Berkeley, go Bears. Go Bears. And was previously at NUS in Singapore and is now down the road at Princeton, and we're very excited that he's so close. He's going to talk for about 30 to 40 minutes. I'll have a couple of questions, and then we'll just throw it open to a more general conversation.
Great. Thanks, John. So I'll just wait until slides get put up. Great. So thanks for bearing with us there. So thanks, John, and thanks everyone for the introduction. So as John said, I'm an assistant professor at Princeton, and today I'm talking about my new book, which is titled States Against Nations. You can see it here. I foolishly did not bring any copies to this book talk, so I'm sorry. But if you email me, I promise I will send you a very large discount code, and you can purchase your own. It's worth it. So what I'm going to do today is give an overview of the main theoretical argument of the book. And then I'm just going to dive into one of the empirical chapters in the book. In my experience, giving sort of a full book presentation is often unsuccessful. So I'm just going to dive into one of the chapters. But during the Q&A, I'm happy to have a conversation about the other elements of the book, the other chapters. One caveat, I'm a political scientist by training. I tend to be a sort of fire-breathing quantitative political scientist by training. I've tried my best to make the statistics on which the book is premised accessible to everyone. But again, I'm happy to sort of clarify as we go through. So what I want to do is start my presentation with some events that occurred 4 or 5 years ago in Kabupaten Kerom, which is a district in eastern Indonesia on the island of Papua. And at the time, as you can see in this photograph, a group of about 100 protesters had gathered outside the local branch of the Civil Service Agency. So you can see them here gathered. And the men in this photograph were examination failures. And they were mostly men, and I think that's worth highlighting. They were examination failures, and they were frustrated about not having gotten a government job. But they were doubly frustrated about this new system of computerized civil service examinations that the Indonesian government had recently rolled out. And this was a system that they claimed was making it possible for privileged outsiders from the island of Java to take the examination in places where they believed the competition to be less stiff, where they would have a leg up. They could outstrip the competition, like this district pictured here. Now, the protest that day unfortunately spiraled out of control, and the local branch of the Civil Service Agency was burned down, as you can see here. And you might say, well, this is just sort of a one-off event. So I want to emphasize that over this same time period, around early 2020, there were similar events in Kabupaten Timika, as well as in Kabupaten Mapi, just down the road, also on the island of Papua. Now, about a week after these events unfolded, I just incidentally had a meeting with the head of the Indonesian Civil Service Agency, a guy named Pak Bima at the time. And I asked Pak Bima, I said, how we should think about what happened. And I asked him specifically if he thought this new system of computerized tests was worth it given the grievances that it was creating and the conflict that it was generating. And his response was really interesting, and I think it, in a way, captures the argument of the book. So I've quoted it here in full. He says, well, the bright kids from Java apply to those areas where they will be competitive, like Kalimantan or Papua. And after 2 to 3 years, they request a transfer and go back to Java. The question, he said, is actually how to get the Javanese to stay longer. But in Papua, the locals reject, sometimes fiercely, people from outside. But unfortunately, he said they don't have the skills to fill those roles. So what I think is so interesting about this quote is that Pak Bima is blunt about the trade-off, right? He recognizes that there's a cost in the decision to use examinations to recruit civil servants. So as we know from these large literatures in education and sociology, success on examinations, whether academic or civil service, tends to reflect existing inequalities in society. And this is a dynamic that means that privileged groups are going to outstrip marginalized groups in the competition for government jobs, right? And this is a dynamic that I think what's so interesting, it's a dynamic that by his own admission is liable to provoke conflict, right? But he says it's worth it. Examinations is going to lead to gains in the quality of service delivery. We're going to get better civil servants. And so in other words, he'd weighed the costs and benefits and he'd simply come down on the side of the benefits. So what I'm going to argue today and what I argue in the book is that Pak Bima's response to my question, as well as these events that I described earlier, these things matter because they collectively reveal an important and I think sort of generally overlooked trade-off between state building on the one hand and nation building on the other. So in general, the relationship between these two things is thought to be positive. So when governments engage in state building by doing things like building roads or building bridges, it's thought that they're also creating the conditions that lead to the emergence of a cohesive national identity. So Ernest Gellner has argued as much, Benedict Anderson has argued as much. And this is an idea that's summarized nicely in this quote that I put up here from Alberto Alesina, who's a famous political economist. And he says, higher state capacity results in more nation building, which then makes building state capacity easier still. So it's this symbiotic cycle, right? So the central observation motivating my book is that certain acts of state building actually present headwinds or challenges for inclusive nation building. So to continue with this example of infrastructural capacity that I'm talking about, governments and rulers are always going to face budget constraints. And these budget constraints mean that you're going to face decisions over where to allocate those new schools or those new bridges. And you're going to be forced to allocate these to certain regions or certain ethnic groups. And this is undeniably going to generate grievances on the part of groups that are passed over. This is sort of unavoidable, but in the extreme, it may spark conflict that undermines nation building. So to return to the context at hand, which is bureaucratic selection, one of the most important aspects of quote unquote state building is the task of hiring a competent core of bureaucrats to staff the organs of one's government. This is like really the essence of state capacity. Right? And so we can call this, if you will, the sort of personnel perspective on state building. And I think, when seen from this personnel perspective and in light of Pak Bima's response to my question, we can see that these efforts to hire that competent core of bureaucrats are sparking conflict. State building and nation building, I argue, are at odds with one another in this context. And so what I do in the book is try and generalize this argument and then marshal evidence in support of this claim. Okay. And now this claim depends on certain conditions that I've highlighted here, but which I'll sort of just skip over, but I'm happy to talk about during the Q&A. And what I argue is that when these conditions are met, the introduction of meritocratic selection is associated with uneven group representation in the bureaucracy that in turn can spark conflict that undermines an inclusive nation building. So in the book, I described sort of two mechanisms through which this happens. The first is what I call the citizen side mechanism, which is the idea that, well, if there's uneven representation in the bureaucracy, citizens who are petitioning for services from that bureaucracy may come to turn against the idea of a state in which they exist on uneven footing with other groups within the state. The second mechanism is what I call this applicant side mechanism, which concerns the frustration of individuals who are passed over for government jobs and who might be sort of doubly frustrated by the knowledge that certain groups are benefiting more than others. So we can think about the examples that I opened this talk with, right? So what I'm going to do today, like I said, is focus in on a single chapter, which is this applicant side mechanism chapter. And what I'm going to do is identify how the outcomes of civil service examinations may be undermining levels of national identification. And the evidence I'm going to use for this chapter comes from a survey that I conducted in partnership with the BKN, the Indonesian Civil Service Agency, in which we solicited survey responses from over 3.5 million applicants to the Indonesian civil service. And so we received responses from about 205,000 candidates to the civil service. And then using this survey, I connect those responses to the backend database of test scores, which enables me to look at people's responses as a function of how they perform on that civil service exam. And what I'm going to show you is that the experience of failing the civil service exam meaningfully affects people's attitudes on a range of very important attitudes, right? Especially national identification. And I'm going to show you that these attitudinal shifts unfold over a massive scale concerning large numbers of people, which I think makes it possible to assert that something as sort of technocratic and perhaps small as bureaucratic selection is actually affecting something as vast as concerns over inclusive nation building in Indonesia today. So what I'll do is just sort of give you a brief outline of the remainder of the talk. I'm going to introduce sort of this new hypothesis about meritocratic selection that motivates the book and really more specifically this chapter that I'm talking about. I'll give you an overview of the sort of status of civil service examinations in Indonesia today, and perhaps I'll call on Pak Winanto to give some of his expertise as well. And then I'll talk about this research design, which is this, I think, uniquely large-scale survey. And then I'll go through the results. And like I said, it's going to be quantitative in nature. But again, if you have any questions, I'm happy to stop and answer for clarification. So it's worth, I think, sort of briefly, before ragging on meritocratic selection for the next 30 minutes, making the positive case for merit systems, right? And so there's really, I think, several reasons to support civil service recruitment via meritocratic selection. But most of the reasons revolve around what we might call the capacity hypothesis, which is this idea that countries that introduce meritocratic selection for civil servants report superior state capacity, and this leads to gains in the quality of service delivery. And this is like one of the most robust hypotheses in the study of bureaucracy, right? We know this to be true, and there's good evidence that supports it. There's, I think, two mechanisms that this obtains. The first is this idea that, well, examinations are expressly designed to identify competent or at least credentialed individuals, and competent bureaucrats are going to execute policies more effectively than incompetent bureaucrats. And this is going to lead to gains in the quality of service delivery and also downstream economic growth. The second reason, and I actually think this is perhaps more important, is that under meritocratic selection, future bureaucrats don't, quote unquote, owe their position to anyone. Right? And this is going to undercut incentives to engage in corruption and rent seeking and expropriation, because you're not going to have a politician that's leaning on you saying, do this, do that, because you don't owe your position to anyone. Now, the evidence backs this up. So what I've done here is just a sort of easy, quick scatter plot on the x-axis showing a meritocratic index, which is drawn from the VDEM data set. And so higher values denote more meritocratic countries and lower values denote less meritocratic countries. And then on the y-axis, I'm showing you GDP growth over a 10-year time horizon. And what you see is there's just this positive relationship between these two things, right? So on the right-hand side, you see Singapore, the world's most meritocratic country, as they would love to tell you, reporting really strong 200% economic growth over this time frame, right? And to be clear, in the book, I don't dispute this, right? This is, in fact, something that I sort of evidence and I take for granted. What I'm doing in the book instead is trying to point out sort of overlooked consequences of meritocratic selection. I'm trying to highlight some of the unintended consequences of this, not to dispute that it does lead to gains in the quality of service delivery. And in fact, in the Indonesian context, with the introduction of the computer-based test, I think you do see this emerging, right? And so to be clear, I'm not disputing this in any way. Instead, what I'm doing is trying to sort of highlight two of the unintended consequences of meritocratic selection. So the first, I've already mentioned this in the sort of introduction, is this idea that examinations tend to sort of reproduce existing inequalities in society, whether along ethnic, class, or religious lines. Right? And this happens for several reasons that I think are worth highlighting. So the first is what you might call biased content. So examination questions have to come from somewhere. Right? And occasionally, not always, examination questions will reflect content or knowledge held and pervaded by dominant groups in society. And so to just give you one example, in the 2018-2019 civil service exam in the basic competency test, there's a national character section in the exam, and it contained questions about the Majapahit Empire. Right? And this is an ancient kingdom centered on the island of Java, and you could surmise, for instance, that this is content that the ethnic Javanese are going to be better positioned to answer correctly than individuals on the island of Papua, for instance. And this might, on the margins, have representational consequences. To be clear, I don't think this is really what's driving a lot of the representational consequences, but I think it's worth briefly highlighting. Instead, I think uneven access to expensive tutoring services, as well as uneven access to early childhood education, is driving a lot of the representational imbalances that we see as a consequence of meritocratic selection. And so to the extent that those socioeconomic disadvantages dovetail with existing ethnic or religious or regional lines in a given society, it's going to have these representational consequences that in turn filter up. And again, the evidence backs this up. So what I'm doing here is showing you on the x-axis that same meritocracy index that's scaled from -2 to, in this case, 3. And then on the y-axis is a measure of a country's between group bureaucratic inequality. And so this is an index that I've constructed based on census data in which higher values denote a more unequal bureaucracy. It does a worse job of representing the population that it serves. And then lower values denote a greater representation, okay? And so what you see is that as countries get more meritocratic, you see a slight increase in the extent of bureaucratic inequality in terms of representation, right? So again, I think the evidence backs up this idea that it's associated with these representational concerns. The second feature of meritocratic selection that I emphasize in the book and in this chapter in particular is the idea that it's a mode of selection that uniquely, I think, impacts the attitudes of aspirants. Right? And this is true for winners and losers, but I'm going to focus mostly on the experience of failing an exam here. And so more generally, examination failure prompts resentment on the part of losers. And I think this happens for several reasons. I mean, most of us here are in the education business. I don't think this is going to come as a terrible surprise to people who have dealt bad grades to students before, but I think it's worth sort of going through the ways in which examination failure drive resentment in this particular context, especially given that it's this very high stakes test that results in outright employment. So the first is what I call insulted dignity. It's the idea that the nature of failure under meritocratic selection is this sort of highly individualized rebuke. You're being judged and evaluated to possess insufficient merit, and this might generate forms of resentment as a means of psychological protection. Right? You don't want to sort of individually see yourself as a failure. Another reason to think it might generate resentment has to do with what I call sunk costs, the idea of having sort of wasted your time in futile preparation. So like I said, often in preparation for these civil service exams, individuals will take a week, they'll take 2 weeks, they'll take 2 months off of work, they'll study. If you go to a coffee shop in Jakarta before the civil service exam, you know, people will be studying for it. It happens. And so people will perhaps feel these sunk costs were incurred as a consequence of failure, and this might generate resentment. This all sort of falls under this umbrella that I call frustrated expectations, which is this concept with a long history in political science and which concerns the sting of not having achieved one's ambitions and which has been shown across contexts to generate forms of frustration and resentment, right? And so what I do in the chapter is try and take these two ingredients that I see as sort of downstream of examination failure and see them as the engine of this theory, right? And so on the one hand, I'm thinking about these mechanisms of sort of psychological failure relating to insulted dignity, sunk costs, frustrated expectations, and then combined with the knowledge that certain outgroups have been disproportionately more successful on this exam to see what happens as a consequence of exam failure. And so these are the things that I'm measuring on that survey that I talked about earlier. So the first, and this doesn't really relate to national identification, but I think is nonetheless an interesting outcome, relates to perceptions of corruption. And I'm going to hypothesize that individuals who fail on this exam are going to sort of believe there to have been more corruption in the recruitment process as a means of psychological protection. They're going to want to sort of label the process as having been unfair as a means of, again, sort of exculpating their own role in that examination failure. Now, the next two outcomes are more related to the broader theory of the book. The first relates to in-group preferentialism. So the idea that you're going to advocate for preferential treatment for members of your in-group, be it regional, ethnic, religious, on the idea that you're sort of seeking out a means of policy redress to your own individual failure. And then finally, this is the sort of most important outcome for the broader argument of the book, is this idea that examination failure on the civil service exam is going to lead to a decline in national identification. And the idea here is that individuals will turn against the symbolic core of the state that's just denied them employment, especially given that the state has sort of revealed that it's more interested in this case of recruiting individuals from a different group or from a different region. Okay. So these are the sort of three sub-hypotheses that I test in this particular chapter. So to situate it, what I'm looking at is meritocratic selection in Indonesia. And so I want to acknowledge that to some, Indonesia may seem an unusual place to study meritocratic selection. So there's a sort of large literature documenting the extent to which selection and bureaucratic promotion is governed by patronage in Indonesia, right? Now, what I argue in the book is that this may still be true for certain forms of bureaucratic transfer and promotion, particularly at the local level, but it no longer characterizes bureaucratic selection in Indonesia, right? As a consequence of reforms that were introduced in 2014, but then on a national scale in 2018 and 2019, Indonesia has introduced basically an incorruptible computer-based test for the selection of civil servants, right? And this has really, I think, driven a meritocratic shift in how bureaucrats are recruited. And I'm happy to talk more about how this computer-based test operates, but it's really, really quite interesting, and I'll get into it a little bit in the presentation. But basically, it has a pool of about 10,000 questions that are created by sort of psychometricians, which is this is an occupation of individuals, and then these questions are then randomly selected onto computer portals that individuals then take. Now, to get into the exam room, you have to scan biometrics. So a big problem in previous eras was with a practice called jockeying. So individuals would take a test for someone else, and you can no longer do this. You have to go through biometric scans. So again, I mean, Indonesia has really seen a transformation towards meritocratic selection in bureaucracy. Okay. So the way that the system works, and I've included the numbers here for the period 2018, 2019, which is what I focus on. So individuals submit an application. You can submit an application to one job and one job only. In 2019, you could see how many other applicants had applied to that job. This is no longer true. You can no longer see as like a strategic consideration, but you could at the time. Your application then goes to a process called administrative selection, which is a centralized process. It happens at the BKN in Jakarta. You have to submit a cover letter, a CV, a 3x5 passport photo, which is a common reason that people were failing this step, is that they had an incorrect passport photo. If you pass the administrative selection stage, you then go to the basic competency test, the SKD. And the basic competency test is a 90-minute test. It's computerized. It has 3 sections, and it's scored out of 500 points. In 2018, 2019, the threshold was set at 255 points. Right? If you were below the threshold of 255, your screen flashes red, you fail, you're immediately not passing. Right? If you're above the 255 threshold, you may have been invited to continue. And I say may because the next step is what's known as the rule of 3. And so for the rule of 3, the top 3 scoring candidates for each occupation or each opening on the exam were invited to continue. And this scales according to the number of openings. So if there's 3 openings, then it means 9. If there's 4, then it means 12. If you were in the top 3, then you're invited to take the specialist exam, which is often a computer-based test, but not always a computer-based test, right? And so I was talking to Pa Winanto earlier, and the specialist exam for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs includes things like a psychometric evaluation. It includes, I believe, a foreign language essay.
We have 7 layers.
Yeah, 7 different components. So each ministry creates its own specialist exam. If you're applying to be a prison guard, you have to do a push-up test, actually. And so there's these different components. The scores then get integrated, weighted at 60% and 40% respectively, and then the top scoring candidate is selected for the job. Now, importantly for the theory that I want to test today, existing inequalities in Indonesia are very much reflected in the exam scores. Okay, so what I've done here is create a heat map at the district level that shows the share of individuals in each kabupaten that failed the SKD, the basic competency test. So darker colors indicate greater number of failed applicants. And what you see is that in Eastern Indonesia and Maluku and Sulawesi, you see upwards of 60, 70% of individuals failing the SKD. But then, of course, on Java, particularly in Central and East Java, you see really high success rates. Okay. Another way to look at this is sort of graphically. I'm a big fan of scatter plots, if you can't tell. And so what you're seeing here on the x-axis is the district level poverty rate, and on the y-axis is the percent of applicants in that district who failed the SKD. And you see, again, this positive relationship. For those of you familiar with Indonesia, the districts on the tails of this distribution are precisely those that we would expect. So on the far left-hand side, you see Tangerang Selatan, which is a wealthy suburb of Jakarta, in which only about 17% of applicants failed SKD. And then on the far right-hand side, you see Maluku Barat Daya, which is a district on the eastern periphery of Indonesia, in which about 70% of applicants failed the test. Okay. So you can imagine how this test is going to have representational consequences when you think about it in these terms. Okay, so the data that I'm going to marshal in this chapter tries to evaluate this hypothesis that I introduced earlier, which is that failure on the Indonesian civil service exam caused these meaningful attitudinal changes, particularly as it related to national identification. The data that I marshal in support of this comes from this partnership with the BKN, in which they gave me access to the database of test scores from the 2018-2019 cycle. This database had an email address for each applicant. Right? They needed an email address in order to sign up. And so using these email addresses, we sent surveys to everyone who applied 16 months after the exam. Right? And like I said, we got response from about 205,000 individuals. What I do in the chapter is I compare the attitudes of narrow winners and narrow losers. So I focus on the narrow winners and narrow losers because you might imagine that someone that gets a very low score and a very high score are just going to be different on a number of margins. Right? One's going to be better educated, and one's going to be worse educated, one's going to be rich, one's going to be poor. And so what I do is focus on people that were within a single percentage point of having failed or not. And I make the claim that these people are basically exchangeable. Right? One way you could think about this is as a student who gets an 89.9% on an exam and gets a B, and another student who gets a 90.0% and gets an A. Right? These are basically comparable students, but they experience those grades in very different ways. And that's basically what I'm going to do here. I'm just going to look at people who narrowly pass and narrowly fail to see if there are any changes in attitudes right around that threshold. And then in the survey, I look at a bunch of different things. So like I said, I look at perceptions of corruption. I look at a measure of what I call Javan preferentialism. So this isn't Javanese preferentialism. It's preferentialism for the island of Java, right? So that would include Sundanese and Banten as well. I look at a measure of regional preferentialism. So the extent to which you believe members of your kabupaten, for instance, to deserve preferential treatment. I look at religious intolerance as well. And then finally, I look at national identification. Right? And so I ask questions like support for Pancasila or people's identification as an Indonesian versus a specific ethnic group. And so looking back at this sort of flowchart, you might imagine, well, if you're interested in the effect of failure and meritocratic selection, there's a number of junctures at which individuals can fail. Right? And so just to be clear, what I'm going to look at is at this last stage. I'm going to compare people who made it to the final stage, and I'm going to look at their attitudes across whether they failed or passed right at that final juncture. Are there any questions so far? All good? Yeah.
So out of that 205,000 responses, what's actually the sample that you're
right here?
Yeah.
It narrows down quite considerably. I want to say it's 4,000 of that 205,000 that are within 1% at this last stage. Okay, so I'll just walk you through very quickly what the research design is doing. So what I'm showing you here on the x-axis is the distance to an alternative disposition. Right? So if you're to the right of that dotted line, you got a job. If you're to the left of that dotted line, you failed and did not get a job. And then on the y-axis, I'm looking at corruption perceptions. Right? Now you can see that it's centered at 0, right? Which makes sense. If you got a job in the Indonesian civil service as a consequence of this exam, you're not going to say that there was any corruption in the process. Right? This makes sense. It's intuitive. Now, if you just cross that threshold, what you see is that there's this big uptick in perceptions of corruption, okay? Which makes sense. Again, you're going to try and exculpate your own role in the process. You're going to say that there was unfairness, it was corrupt, etc. Now, like I said, I'm focusing on individuals that are very, very close to this threshold, right? So these individuals highlighted here in pink. And then I'm going to estimate in terms of standard deviations, the difference between these two things. And so what you see is that the narrow fact of failure led to about a 0.6 standard deviation uptick in perceptions of corruption. Now, for those of you who are not quantitatively inclined, this is a massive, massive effect, right? Like really, like just inordinately large. We deal with like 0.1, 0.15 standard deviations in the social sciences. So this is quite large. And if we were to just put it in sort of absolute terms, it's about a 20 to 25 percentage point increase. So it goes from 0 to 25% of people saying that it was corrupt right at the experience of failure. All right. Now, just for sort of ease of sort of brevity, if you will, I present these results in the sort of coefficient plot framework, what we call in political science. And so this is that 0.62 standard deviation increase as a consequence of corruption. And then for these other things, instead of showing you that graph, I'm just going to plot it here. But again, you should just interpret those numbers just as the difference in attitudes right at the threshold. Yeah, Margaret.
I want to make sure.
Yeah.
The perception of corruption was about the exam, not anything broader. Than
Yeah, it was like, it was specifically the exam. Like, I think the questions were, one question was like, to what extent were factors like SARA important? So like suku agamaras. And of course, like, the answer is not at all because the exam was determinative. And another question was like, to what extent do you think connections were important in getting the job? Right. So these were the sort of questions that I asked. So the next outcome that I look at is support for Javan preferentialism among residents of Java. All right. So what we're looking at here are individuals that reside on the island of Java and who fail the exam. And then we ask them, do you think there should be preferential treatment for the island of Java? And what you see is that there's this 0.25 standard deviation uptick in this, right? Among residents off the island of Java, you see no effect. And then again, this more general measure of regional preferentialism, you see an uptick among individuals who fail, right? And so this is a demand oftentimes for increased affirmative action for individuals from that region. There's no effect of failure on religious intolerance. And then finally, the sort of main outcome that I look at in the book and in the chapter looks at national identification. And what I see is that the experience of failing the civil service exam led to this 0.14 standard deviation decline in national identification. Okay. So in magnitude, it's not as big, but it's still, I think, quite meaningful. So the preferred interpretation of these results is that this is a consequence of the sting of failure. But one of the challenges here is that the differences that I'm observing around this threshold could be the effect of success, right? I'm saying that you fail and then your attitudes go down. You become less likely to identify with the Indonesian national identity. It could be that you pass and you become more likely to identify with the Indonesian national identity. And that's why you observe this difference, right? And so what I do in the book is try and draw on qualitative interviews with applicants to the civil service who failed and who passed. And so basically what I did was hang around on the day of the civil service exam in Jakarta and elsewhere across Indonesia and talk to applicants who are going through this experience. And I mostly talked honestly with their parents. So one of the things that happens increasingly with this computer-based test is that there will often be sort of scoreboards set up that are monitoring the results of the computer-based test. And this is done out of a concern of transparency. It's quite a good practice, in fact, because if people's scores are transparent, then it's sort of incorruptible, and people's parents will assemble and they'll watch. But the consequence is that after the exam, it's very public who passed and who failed, right? And I think this is driving a lot of the sting of failure and frustration, is that it's such a public shaming event in a sense. And so it's done out of transparency, and I think that's quite good, but it has this sort of reverse consequence. Now you might say, well, Nick, like this is sort of cute little research design and it's like sort of cool data, but like, does this really matter, right? Does this actually affect things like as big as like nation building today in Indonesia? And so, what I want to say in response to this is like, my concern with this project initially was an understanding how these civil service exams were affecting broader currents in Indonesian political society, right? And so I think it's worth, in response to this, highlighting just the scale of how many people are applying to the Indonesian civil service every year, right? And also the ratio of success to failure. So in 2018, 2019, I'm looking at 3.6 million people who applied. The ratio of success to failure is about 20 to 1. And so even if these effects are maybe small, you might say they're not that big, they're operating on a ratio that's, I think, quite significant. Now, just in an absolute sense, this is a large number. This is about 2% of the Indonesian population that applied for a government job, maybe a little bit less. But then when you zoom in specifically on the constituency of individuals who are eligible to apply in the first place, so these are people between the ages of 18 and 35, I think, or maybe 21 and 35 with a college degree. It's about 46% of all eligible applicants in 2018 that applied for a government job. And then again, you have to remember that this is a single year. This is a single snapshot. The demand for these government jobs in and out every single year is this large, right? And so these effects are operating year in, year out on this tranche of the population. And so I think it's worth taking seriously that there are these attitudinal consequences that are unfolding over a very, very large scale. Okay. So I've talked for too long, so I'll sort of wrap up. And so what I did today was just give you this sort of very narrow glimpse into a single chapter, which looks at this applicant side analysis on meritocratic selection. I think there's several sort of responses you might have to this. Well, it's like, first is, well, what's the broader counterfactual? If not meritocratic selection, then how should they recruit civil servants in Indonesia, right? And I think this is a very reasonable concern. I think especially one might say, well, suppose you were to recruit through a different mechanism, quotas, affirmative action, patronage-based selection. All forms of selection generate grievances. There are always going to be winners and losers. So aren't these effects just always going to be present? And this is something that I try and grapple with in another chapter in the book that I'll just sort of briefly talk about, which is this comparative historical analysis that looks at the Dutch East Indies and French Indochina during the 19th and early 20th century. And what I do in this chapter is take up this sort of like classic question in Southeast Asian studies, which is, why is it that French Indochina at the moment of independence fractured into 3 units, whereas the Dutch East Indies stayed together in a single unit? And what I do in this chapter is look at how variation in selection into the indigenous civil services at the time explains these divergent trajectories. And so what I observe is that in French Indochina, the French introduced a meritocratic selection mechanism. Now, the consequence of this was basically ethnic domination by the Vietnamese over the Laotians and the Cambodians. And so here I digitized a bunch of personnel records for about 40 or 45 years. And in the red line, I'm looking at the share of bureaucrats in Laos and Cambodia, by the way, who are ethnic Vietnamese. And as a consequence of meritocratic selection, what you see is just total domination by the Vietnamese, who have a legacy of the Mandarinate system. They're better educated going into colonialism. And so they're dominating on these tests. And so at the moment of independence, what you have are ethnic Vietnamese lording over Laotians and Cambodians in Phnom Penh and Vientiane. And it sort of foreclosed the possibility of any inclusive Indo-Chinese nationalities. So the historian Christopher Gosha has written, I think, really nicely about this topic, for instance. In the other half of the chapter, I look at the Dutch East Indies, and in which the Dutch had implemented basically a system of aristocratic patronage during the 19th and early 20th century. And so they left at the near sort of total discretion of local bupatis the recruitment of civil servants in the Pangkare Praja. Right. Now, the consequence of this was that you saw more or less ethnic self-rule. Right? So bupatis were recruiting from within their networks, and this prevented the sort of lording over of different groups over one another. And so what I'm showing you here are the maps of transfers within the Pangkare Praja over the period of about 60 years until 1940. And if you squint your eyes and tilt your head and look at it just right, what you're going to see is basically there are very few transfers that happen across the West and Central Java line. Right? Now, it's a rough approximation. It's not perfect, but this is basically where the Sundanese and Javanese cutoff happens. And so I think what you're seeing is sort of ethnic self-rule in the Dutch East Indies that ironically enabled the emergence of an inclusive Indonesian national identity. Right? And so this is sort of what I grapple with in the historical section of the book. So elsewhere, I try and extend the argument, looking at the sort of different cases to which the argument applies. And then what I spend a lot of time doing in the book, just I'll briefly end on this point, is trying to think about how leaders grapple with the trade-off that I've identified here. Right? And so in other words, politicians and rulers are not naive to the representational challenges of different forms of bureaucratic selection. Right? And so if you think about Pat Bima's quote at the beginning, right, he's not naive in any way about the sort of challenges associated with bureaucratic selection. And so elsewhere in the book, I think about the strategies that rulers deploy or politicians deploy in response to this trade-off. But what I argue is that the very fact that politicians are called upon in the first place to deploy these strategies attests to the sort of unifying argument of the book, which is that state building and nation building are in tension with one another, at least in this context. So I will stop there, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions and comments. I'm going to end with a picture of the book so you can see the cover. Thank you.
Nick, that was great. Thank you so much. I think we're going to actually reverse it and see if people have questions, and I will retain my moderator's kind of ability to kind of throw some things as we go. I will say one kind of framing comment. I do think you undersell the robustness of the book. You integrate an incredible amount of historical literature, not to besmirch quantitative political scientists that are routinely not, and are immersed in the cases that you discuss in a way that's really rich and incredibly valuable. And that kind of mixed method approach, I think, really sets the book apart in a field, which I think is really impressive and really a testament to some really excellent work.
I appreciate that. Thank you, John.
But let's see if people have some initial questions. Otherwise, I have a whole list here. So, Sydney.
I have two questions. One, does it matter what kind of job people are applying for? And I'm thinking particularly of teachers, since they constitute such a big part of the civil service.
Yeah.
And it would be interesting to know whether there's any difference between teachers who are usually on the lower end of the civil service spectrum and some of the other jobs available. And the other question is the interaction with local executives, because when I think of Papua or Eastern Indonesia, you've got whoever gets into power, voted into power, able to appoint lots of people to the top positions in the ministries and so on. And how does that intersect?
So I'll start, I guess, in reverse. I mean, my sense is when you have a Bupati that comes to power at the local level, there's a lot of transfers that happen, but the amount of direct recruitment is not terribly high, right? So people will get non-jobbed. You know, this is one of my favorite Indonesian words is di non-jobkan, for instance, is when you're promoted into an irrelevant position when a new Bupati comes in. But my sense is that that's recruitment that's happening within people who are already at senior levels within the PNS, rather than fully external individuals. So, you know, I mean, I could be wrong, but that was sort of my sense of how it operated.
Yeah, I was just, I mean, my sense of things may be very old, but I had thought that the Bupatis also managed to get a lot of appointments of teachers.
Yes, but these are they're contract teachers often, for
Okay.
instance. So like Jan Pierscala and Audrey Sachs have this nice paper in the BJPS, I think, in which they show that there are these cycles around elections in which the number of teachers that get hired just spike massively in an election year. But these are not PNS teachers. These are contract teachers or temporary hires. And so to be clear, you know, the focus of this work is entirely on PNS. So these are, you know, tenured civil servants within the professional civil service. You know, there's about 5 million PNS in Indonesia. We actually don't know the total number of Indonesian government employees because there's probably anywhere from 10 to 15 million additional temporary hires about which we just don't have comprehensive data. And local executives use these temporary hires for patronage purposes all the time. And there's a number of reasons for that, but they have a lot more discretion in the hiring and recruitment of those contract employees. In response to your first question, like, does it matter which kind of job people are applying to? In terms of like occupational categories, I haven't looked at this. My sense is no, but there is variation in where the effects obtain in terms of the level of government that you're applying to. So you can apply to local positions for the Kabupaten or Kota level, the provincial positions, of which there's very few, and then the central government positions. The effects are mostly driven by people applying at the Kabupaten level, rather than the central government level. And I think this makes sense in light of some of the dynamics that I'm talking about, where a lot of the resentment is driven by individuals from sort of forgotten or marginalized regions that are getting frustrated by certain individuals from other provinces applying for jobs in these places. And so it's happening mostly at the local level, right? I talked to one of my interviews was after, you remember the Poso earthquake, for instance, and I talked to a young man, and he said this was in Semarang, and he said he was applying for a job in Poso. And I said, well, why? And he said, well, there's a lot of opportunities out there right now. And so there's like these sort of strategic dynamics that go into where people are applying. The other category of individual that's driving a lot of these sort of effects is that it breaks down heavily along gendered lines. So it's particularly young men that are driving a lot of these effects rather than young women who respond with perhaps more resilience to defeat than men do. So that's some of like the variation that we see in the results.
To pick up on that last, what's the gender like breakdown of applicants and successful?
Yeah, so there's more women that apply overall, and women do better on the SKD, I think, but then men do better on the SKB, which is the specialist exam. I could be wrong on that. That's my sense.
Tika, then Margaret.
Oh, yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. So I just wonder when you took the sample, when did you take the sample from?
So it was, we initially planned to send the survey in March 2020. Something happened, and we had to postpone, but then we sent the survey in July and August 2020.
Because I just want to share with everyone here. So I was actually one of those who failed to be the civil servant.
Yeah.
I took the test in 2021, and I was in fact applying to Winanto's office. I just literally graduated at that time
Yeah.
from my undergrad, and then I applied to be a civil servant at Kemenlu,
Yeah.
Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I failed. But I got hired by another ministry, which I became the consultant to them. And I thought like, oh, this is interesting. They don't want me to be civil servant, but they're gonna hire me as a consultant. And then the thing is like, it's pretty interesting because when you mention about the computer-based test and like other things as a components to this, it's really interesting how these factors are quite very relevant to like what other people also might think when they fail, like the change of attitudes. For example, in my case, I didn't have the perception of like, oh, this test is corrupted. No, I don't have that because like everything seems to be very like it's great. Like I mean, it's very transparent, and it is true that you can get like your result right after the test. Like you can see everybody's result on the screen. And but my main concern at that time was more like, if this is how they are filtering people who wants to actually contribute and work for the government, it doesn't really make sense. Like, because the questions are not like very relevant to the role that I'm applying to. Like, there are people that I know who's been like working in the public sector, like they're analysts at like foreign policy community of Indonesia. They're like really good researchers at like CSIS. And when they applied to be a civil servant, they failed in the computer-based test. Like, I know some really great researchers from CSIS and every other like researchers, and they just failed and they couldn't be a diplomat because they just failed in the CBT, basically the computer-based test. And my perception is that this is not corrupted. It's just like, are there any other ways that they can recruit like these people better? Because in fact, like they ended up coming to me and like my other colleagues and creating a task force in the government to get the job done, because the civil servants are not enough, apparently. They need to hire like professionals like me, my colleagues, and other people that are coming from the industry to do the civil service job. I feel like, oh my God, if this is the case, then you better like fix the way you do this, recruit people, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be curious to hear about Winanto's comments as well, but
We have to move on. You want to interview him, Reggie. First, actually, I know Pak Bima personally when he was still the deputy He was the one that created for the first time in 2014 the computer-based test. And at the time, it is an offer by BKN, so the agency, civil service agency, that whoever the ministry or agency, government agencies, ready to do the CAT, computer assisted test, then please feel free to do it first. And Ministry of Foreign Affairs was the first one, actually. When we applied at that time, I still remember the first selection was conducted, began in the May 1st, 2014. It is Sunday. And then we chose the first day during the weekdays. On Monday, then because Pak Bima's team wants to be the first one, they did it on Sunday. No, the thing is, first, yeah, if you mentioned there are two tests. The first basic competency test, it is under the civil service agency. As you already mentioned, I cannot argue, I can agree more with your argument, but we have to see in several perspectives. First, central government agencies, and second is the local government. It is, the difference is quite huge. And secondly, about the generation. If you did it in 2018 to 2020, it is still the millennial. But the perspective of Gen Z is quite different. So I was the Deputy Director for Human Capital Management at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 2012 to 2015. And I did it for the first time on 2014. Yeah, and they still struggle with the pilot project. The foreign minister is one of the pilot project. And then when I did it as the director for human capital management, since 2020 to 2022, the map is very different. Before, because the government officials in Indonesia guarantee your salary because we don't have government shutdown. Yeah, in Indonesia, it is guaranteed that until your retirement age, you will receive monthly salary. And not only about the salary, the guarantee of the salary, but it is also social status. It is in my generation, Gen X. If you become the government officials, it is easier to get wife, for instance, rather than in the private sectors, because the salary is guaranteed. Although not many, except the corruption. You did it in the corruption. But then during the Gen Z, I noticed one of the highest demand is becoming a diplomat. So in my generation and also in the millennial, the rate of withdrawal when we already invited the candidates that you pass the exam to become the diplomats, the formation will be fulfilled. Yeah. But after 2020 onward, it is many they withdraw. Although they already passed the exam and they withdraw.
Why?
Of becoming the government officials. I think this is maybe for your next reason.
Yeah.
I think it is good. It's different, the Gen Z. They don't want to be long term usually.
Yeah.
Because it is like long term contract until the retirement age is 60 now. Yeah. So when you are accepted as the government officials at the age of 23rd, 24th, 25th, it is guaranteed until 60. And you become powerful, and you become rich as director generals, for instance, as secretary generals. Yeah, but we cannot guarantee you will become life sufficient. Yeah, when you already 5 years at the seat of government officials. So I can see that there should be different. You should differentiate between the central government agency and local government. Usually, it is very difficult to be corruption during the basic test. Yeah, basic competency test, because it is, you already mentioned rightfully that every time you click, everybody can see, even online.
Mm.
Yeah, if for instance, I have a daughter or son, they join the test, so I can monitor.
Yeah.
From the first minutes until he finishes.
Yeah.
What scores it is. So it is clear, it is transparent. But for the spatial competency test, that is
Yeah.
the local government or the ministries can do cheating there.
Correct.
Yeah.
Wow.
Because sometimes they only do only one layer of test, second layer of test, and it is close the results.
Okay.
But the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we did it all 7 layers. There is no failed, the first test failed, second test failed, no. Everybody has to take the 7 tests. And then at the end of the day, we just calculate the score. And we did it from the very beginning with barcode or QR code. So once you enter the administrative selection, the Director General, Secretary General, they don't know who this is. Yeah, so it is like the close until the result, the final score. And then we just release the name. So that is why a lot of the family of Director Generals, ambassadors, they fail. So it is good for the common people who don't have relation with the high rank officials at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But as I mentioned with you, next, at the end of the test, we have the mental health test. This is the one that the candidates cannot fail. Although your TOEFL 670, 100% correct. Your test, computer assisted test, 100% correct. Your interview is at the highest level. But the score of the mental health test failed, then it's failed. Because actually I'm the one that proposed to the Secretary General. Because once somebody become ambassadors or consul generals, then become weird. So when I asked the director of the psychiatrist from one of the prominent hospital in Indonesia, RSPAD, where the president and vice president usually have a general check-up. Yeah, then I discussed with the director of the psychiatrist, is there any kind of test that can detect the basic personality of somebody? And they have. We call it MMPI. Yes. And then we did it, and the Secretary General asked me, everybody has to be passed this test. Otherwise, although all the grades are the best one, they will fail because we cannot detect it at the end of the, and maybe, but Eva, I think maybe you're the lucky one not becoming this, because sometimes I did, during my assignment, I did as the economic affairs diplomats in my assignment from the very beginning. And then when I choose the consultant to curate, if we want to join a trade show abroad, I asked the consultant, the curator from the US, to select which one of the product that matches the US market. So usually I get complaint, why is my friends, the product is quite good, but not pass the curation? And then I told, maybe you are good, but not in the field of this one. Maybe your product is good for the Middle East market or to the European market, but not the US market. But maybe, Mbak Diva, it is good for you to become the analyst and consultant rather than to become a diplomat.
Yes, I agree, Pak.
Yeah.
I'm happier.
That is what happened at the ministry.
Yeah.
I cannot tell about the other ministry or local government.
But
Thank
I,
you, Nick.
yeah, no, I mean, those, it's so interesting to hear your comments. I think your suggestion to think differently about the local and central government, I mean, it's very important and I agree, but it's also, I think, a response to your question as well. You're saying, the content of this exam is doesn't have any bearing on the job. It's so unfair that this is why we failed. And, I think it's still such early days for this new system. And it's sort of a lowest common denominator system. They introduced a system that would apply for all government hiring, right? Including local governments and central government. And so the content on this exam, yeah, some of it is like a little crazy. Like there's a question on like what the proper measurement of the Indonesian flag is. It's 160 by 90 centimeters, for instance, you know? And like this, but this, I'm sure if you failed and you got that question, you'd be like, this is stupid. Like, what? I cannot believe I failed for this question. But again, they're trying to design a system that is constraining local governments chiefly, and then they're introducing it for central government as well because they need something the same across all contexts. You know, when I presented these results to the BKN and to Pak Bima's team after I did this survey, and they said, well, what should we do? Like, what do you propose? And, you know, I was working with the World Bank at the time as well, who was involved in the sort of assisting with the CAT. And one of the things that we proposed, and I think eventually, hopefully the BKN will move towards this model, is basically using the CAT as like a framework. You know, everything has to be computerized, but then giving much more discretion to ministries that are, say, high capacity, like the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to implementing their own tests so that they don't have these questions like what the proper dimension of the flag is, and they can ask more specific content. And so I think once this framework is in place, then I think there's going to be a lot more tailoring of this. And you can imagine a system where, like, you know, Jakarta or Medan or these high capacity local governments are given permission to design their own CAT. And then there's this sort of standard CAT that's like still in place for lower capacity districts. And so there might be this sort of system that's like an on-ramp. And I think this is sort of what they're moving towards. But I agree, like some of the questions, you know, as part of this book, I took, you know, I got access to one of these study books. There are these study books for the exam, and I wanted to become familiar with the questions. And some of these questions, you know, on like the national character section, you're like, these are sort of some of the content is.
May I add you know, when my eldest daughter graduated from Uni in New York, then my wife asked me, why don't you apply to the Minister of Foreign Affairs? No, I guarantee you will be there. Because the first test, the basic competency test, I do believe if Cheryl, you apply, I can guarantee you will be there. Yeah, you're right. Because of the basic competency test, even maybe if I have to take that test, maybe I will be there.
Yeah.
You're right.
Anyway.
So this conversation is so much more interesting than any question I was going to ask. I wanted you to sort of say whether the sting of failing was more important than biased content, but this has made it much more complicated to even talk about what biased content is. So your last response, so I'm very glad you responded, that this definitely needs reform, but it needs to be an incorruptible path to keep that part, but keep the rest. But the other, so now my question is, what other ways, and this is the inequities of Papua versus Java versus Papua, what can you do for those kinds of, from lower education up? What do you do about that?
So
Are people aware of that? Do they care?
yeah, very aware. You know, I think there's these countervailing concerns, right? On the one hand, you want human capital transfers. You want sort of people moving from central regions to peripheral regions to engage in human capital transfers. You want that. But you also want to be attentive to the fact that there are local concerns in Papua where they want sort of jobs for Putra, Putri Daerah, for instance. And so, you know, they have in place small quotas. We were talking about this earlier. I think it's like 5 to 10% of jobs in, you know, these daerah tertinggal that are reserved for local Putra Daerah, for instance, but it's small. I think you could imagine imposing restrictions on how quickly you can request a transfer. I mean, the problem is, for instance, you're from Java, you take a job in Poso because you know that there's no competition, and then 1 year, 3 years later, you come back, you know? If you require like a 10-year stay or 5 to 10 year stay, I mean, this is a lot to expect. But then you actually get much more human capital transfer. And it's also going to restrict the strategic element that I think is driving some of the resentment. And then if you're there for 10 years, maybe you meet your wife, maybe you meet your husband, and then you stay, and then you actually build the community. And you're, so it's not this like strategic thing. So I think you can imagine some residency requirements or reforming the transfer system. But it's a very challenging thing. I mean, there's these countervailing dynamics. You want human capital transfers, but you want local governance. So these things are at odds with one another sometimes.
Of course, I have lots of questions on the history part.
Yeah. I mean, John's right. I did narrowly focus on a very quantitative element, but the book has a lot more. I mean, there's a lot more historical content in here about bureaucratic selection in Southeast Asia and around the world.
So you're testing the negative effect of nationalism, right?
Yeah.
National identity on the people who fail. When you see a broader decline in national identity for districts with like more local bureaucrats than like non-local bureaucrats.
You mean just on average?
Yeah, on average, like the typical median person who lives in like a district.
Yeah, I mean, this is like not based on the survey data of bureaucrats, but just based on survey data that's like nationally representative on, say, support for Pancasila, which is Indonesia's national ideology. And it's much stronger on Java than it is on the sort of outlying regions, for sure. You see this effect on the national identification effect being larger as well in like Sulawesi and Maluku, for instance, than it is on Java. So there's a lot of regional variation, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So as a PNS Indonesia myself,
Yes.
after the mechanism back then in 2021 or 2022, I was kind of a living witness to try those kind of mechanism and the honorable trends. Like actually, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Cameroon has like Padi mentioned 7 layers of the test. Like the first one is the SKD, we call it like some basic test, and it's very like transparent. And once we click our answer, like it is fully displayed at the publicly, and then it goes until the second layer, which is the SKB. SKB is like the specialization of the test. And actually, amongst the millennials and Gen Z, Cameroon or Ministry of Foreign Affairs are actually one of the institutions that is highly favorable and highly recommended that many young people want to be a diplomat or at least to be PNS because of their reputation of having a meritocracy in terms of their recruitment. I'm not trying to mention other institutions, but Cameroon is one of the prestigious institutions in Indonesia. And I'm actually believing in part because before I joined the Cameroon, I also wanted to consult like Diva said, like we were consultant in another ministry, and it was very different. Like I don't want to say this corrupted, but yeah, I saw a lot of like I don't want to say that.
This meeting's being recorded, but
I don't want to say a lot of money that came to me, but yeah, it's very different with what I experienced in Cameroon.
yeah.
My question is like I want to appreciate like people that is actually fail for the Cameroon or the government official task, because actually you guys will have like another brightest experience more than in the institution itself, because as an government official myself, like actually the one that I want to add more to Pawinanto Adi or to all of you is how do we measure our performance as a PNS or as a government official? Because actually today was the deadline of the credit score SKP, if you are Indonesian government officials. Like today is the deadline that all of the Indonesian government is to kind of report our performance kind of index and score. And I would like to say that it is kind of like like kind of not I want to call bullshit, but it's not bullshit, but you know like what I mean. Like, we have to find another way to measure the PNS initiative performance. Like that's why I think to answer like what Diva's question about that, why do we hire another consultant even though we actually have the PANAS itself inside of the institution is because I think that the measurement of the PANAS inside of institution in Indonesia it's not that in the level of like the private company or the institution abroad. So I think that's one thing that I want to add in this discussion. Maybe Pak Wiranto or everyone of you has a solution about how to measure our performance as a PANAS in Indonesia.
Yeah, this is something that I've talked to the BKN about before. And one of the extensions of this project that I wanted to do, we have the scores now from the CAT. And one way to validate these scores is to correlate them with performance measures 4 years, 5 years, 6 years later. Is it the case that if you score well on the CAT, 5 years later, you're getting better measures on the performance reviews? That would suggest that these tests are doing a good job of capturing something. So when I proposed this, I didn't know about the performance review system in the Indonesian civil service. And the BKN started laughing in the meeting. And I was like, well, why are you laughing? And they were like, these scores mean very little. Like, basically, they're self-evaluations, correct? And then they get reviewed by your supervisor, but the supervisor just always says yes. And so the system creates, and so there's not much, they're not an honest evaluation of performance. And so the question is, well, how can you create honest evaluations of performance? And so the BKN asked me to do some international experience comparisons. And so I went to Singapore, as one does for comparisons on the bureaucracy. And what Singapore does is they have a similar system of self-evaluations that get reported by or reviewed by your supervisor, but they impose a curve. So in a unit, only 20% of people can get a top score, only 30% of people can get a good score, and then 50% of people get satisfactory. And so they require the curve. So it's not the case that everyone can get excellent. There has to be differentiation. And so with this, I think then you start to get perhaps a little bit more. It creates some bad incentives though, right? Because then you're working within your unit and you're looking at the person next to you and you're thinking, this person's my competition, when you need to be working together. And so there are trade-offs, but this is one of the ways that I think you can sort of implement this system.
We're doing it there.
Huh?
We're already doing it now.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the thing is like this, this is something to do with culture as well. If we give the bad mark to my, to my staff or to my, it is not good.
No.
Sometimes there's something to do with that. But for me, if we compare the system with the system that we had 10 years ago, 20 years ago, it is much developed, according to me. Because we cannot compare today and tomorrow. But if we compare it, I already at the Minister of Foreign Affairs 32 years now. And when I joined the Minister of Foreign Affairs, what is in my mind, I was very disappointed. Because in 1993, I joined the Minister of Foreign Affairs. It was very difficult for Indonesian to go abroad, let alone stay in another country for more than 3 years. And Indonesian diplomats has the privilege to have the experience of that. But when I saw for the first time, so I thought before I joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that the mentality, the competency, and also the behavior of Indonesian diplomat must be different from the civil servant from other ministries. In fact, not. And then at that time, I tried to convince myself I will do the development from my own section. That is why I don't know, in the next 25 years, I was the one in charge for the human capital for the all Ministry of Foreign Affairs staffs in the headquarters and all the embassies and consulate generals abroad. And then we did the change, and it is possible as well.
Yeah,
I am the one that proposing to the Secretary General to add the mental health test. Yeah, and he agreed on that. So I do believe the system is not perfect yet, but we are improved. Yeah, and you see, to handle 280 million is different from if we handle 5 million.
Correctly.
Yeah, and also the history is different as well. because you're the Dutch. I don't have to tell you, but under the Dutch colonialism, colonial. And I think the progress is there. We are not perfect, but once again, the windows to develop is there as long as we can learn from our mistakes and our what we call the opportunity to become better and better. Yeah, correct. And we need person like you, the scientist as well, who can see from afar more objectively than us in the playing field. But yes, what's your research is very good, in my opinion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So you have another question?
No, I actually just wanted to, one last thing. So I wonder, I will read your book and then I will try to find out like how do you compare like civil service meritocracy like within Southeast Asian countries, for example. Because I think last Friday I was there with Pat Win, Bu Sydney, and Cheryl, and I mentioned Indonesia is apparently the highest, the second highest like civil service delivery in Southeast Asia. And they were all surprised because we didn't expect it that, given like how it seems to be like very complicated, the bureaucracy and like the everything is just so seems to be corrupted. But apparently like we are apparently on the right track, according to Blavatnik School of Government's research on the index for public service. So yeah, I would just really wanted to know, like according to your, you know, like observation in Southeast Asia, is it really the truth that like how we recruit our civil servants and their delivery processes are actually like reasonable, you know, like doing all these like computer-based assessments, other stuff?
You know, I think in terms of recruitment, I think Indonesia is actually very much on the vanguard in the region. I think the computer-based test is, yeah, sort of trend-setting in the region and much better than even Singapore's recruitment systems, which are quite opaque and personalized. And you know, in terms of service delivery, it's such a challenging thing to talk about in the totality. I mean, you know, one of the challenges in response to your question about like bureaucratic performance, it's really tough to measure bureaucratic performance. You know, when we're talking about the private sector, there's a single indicator that you can measure success. It's called the profit margin, right? When you're talking about bureaucracy and you're talking about service delivery, the quality of it means different things. If you're talking about Puskesmas, if you're talking about the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, if you're talking about Ministry of Finance, tax collection, there's all these different metrics of success, and none of them are externally valid, right? They always have to be measured subjectively. And so it's really difficult to say with any certainty how it's doing. What I will say is, like, I think Indonesia has put in place a technological architecture for performance management that, you know, this is what we were talking about. While it's not there presently, I think it's a system that can be grown into in a way that will drive gains in the quality of service delivery. And then the other thing I'll say is, I think certain pockets of Indonesia's bureaucracy are extremely effective. I think certain pockets of Indonesia's bureaucracy are extremely ineffective. So it's hard to compare it to like Singapore, which is the singular unit, or even Malaysia, which has a much smaller problem to deal with. In Indonesia, you've got just a huge country with sort of vast variation in the quality of service delivery. But pockets within the Ministry of Finance, within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, of course, like very competent, very, very competent. But then pockets within the Ministry of Religion that are not, or whatever. You know? Yeah, or Public Works, for instance. And so, you know, it's just such a big, the Indonesian government is so big compared to Singapore that it's hard to compare. But the emphasis on technology and sort of technocratic reform, I think, that exists within the BKN, I think is good. And I think it's on a positive trajectory, I would say. That'd be my summary.
So if I could ask moderator prerogative at this point. So if you were going to take your model and kind of explore it elsewhere, I think you make a totally compelling case that given the type of conditions that you identify, high intergroup inequality, so on and so forth, that this matters. Kind of what would be the comparisons that you would like to see? Nigeria, like where, I mean, you mentioned in the book, you discussed India, Sri Lanka, a couple of others, but thinking about the scale question and the kind of national local dynamics.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the argument was sort of developed in reference to like the moment of decolonization post-World War II. And this is really where the book came about, is thinking about the French Indochina Dutch East Indies comparison, thinking about in the context of decolonization in Africa, across South and Southeast Asia. And that's really sort of where my mind goes to when I'm thinking about the book. And most of the examples, of course, come from South and Southeast Asia, but I think, you know, across Sub-Saharan Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, these sort of unequal multi-ethnic countries with large hinterlands that face these state building challenges where they need to project power into these hinterlands. I think these are the places where I'm thinking about. You know, one of the questions that I try and grapple with a little bit in the book is like, what's the, you know, policy relevance of this claim? You know, like, what another way of framing your question is like, well, where does this argument like sort of bite in terms of policy relevance? Like, where should we be attuned to the concerns of bureaucratic selection as they may have consequences for nation building? And I think, you know, I imagine, for instance, like a post-conflict setting where the World Bank or the IMF get called in and they're like, we need to rebuild this country. Like, what should we do? And the technocrats from the World Bank say, here's the playbook. Like, you know, you need to do this, this, and this, and you need to introduce meritocratic selection, right? And they do this. This is actually part of their playbook. Like, this is the standard suggestion is like, if you have a bureaucracy, you need meritocratic selection. And I think in a post-conflict setting, this might not be the best suggestion, particularly if that post-conflict setting is one that was, say, ethnic or religious in its origin, in which concerns about representation are going to be front and center. I'm not sure that this would be. So I think like that's a context in which this argument matters a lot. And so I don't have like specific examples in mind, but I think like that's where I would be attuned to it.
And just on the empirics, are you continuing these surveys to see if the effects that you find from this one large survey continue?
You know, I haven't done it. I haven't done a follow-up. We theoretically could. There have since been a few other waves of the CAT. So this was the 2018, 2019 cycle. I think the next one after was in 2022. And then there's another really big one, I think, in 2024. There's like 5 million people that applied or something. So there's been a few since. So I could imagine doing the survey again, but I haven't followed up with the original sample of people who responded to this one.
Yeah.
I have, in giving this talk, occasionally, and I
And
thought
are
this
you
is
allowed to retake the exam?
until you're 35, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But I have, in giving this talk, and I thought this is what he was going to say, I have encountered people who have received my email for a survey request. So someone that applied in 2018, and they pulled up their email during the talk, and they showed that they had the email request. So, but no, I haven't done a follow-up survey. It would be a fun thing to do, though.
You know what else would be interesting would be just looking at some of the newly created ministries where
From their birth.
from their birth, yeah, because we've got, you know, a lot now, new ministries that don't have the same kind of institutional history. And it'd be just interested in knowing probably more about performance evaluation, maybe in those than actually the testing.
I mean, the honest answer to your question, John, is like I'm a little bit more interested in the performance evaluation question these days, and some of the implications of that. So I haven't followed up with the recruitment stuff as much.
Great. Well, it is 6:30. Want to be kind of conscious of people's time. Thank you so much, Nick. This was really good.